Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy this curious story that falls into that indistinct territory somewhere between the curious and the frightening. Also, we all have to start somewhere, and the support of appreciative souls like you will always take us further as we learn our skills from sentence to sentence. I would really value having your support, by you subscribing and then hitting the notification bell, so you can know when the next part is published. And if you wish to learn where the two main characters come from and what the story is all about, then why not go back to the very beginning? Chapter 13. The Unexpected Guest. I'd thought I'd lived a pretty decent life up until then, and was stunned, and I admit quite disappointed by all the bad karma that kept throwing itself at me with such wanton abandon. I'm sure that Shadow would dismiss it as nothing more than character forming. I had far too many dreadful physical injuries for it to be just that. And this was worrying me. Something quite traumatic must be going on deep down and between my ears, and my unconscious clearly didn't want to share it with me. But it's the nature of the unconscious that everything that screws you up will eventually find a way to the surface. And it wasn't something I was looking forward to. Thinking back, I knew that my father was as eager to give up driving as he was to abandon cooking Christmas dinner. I was encouraged and complimented through some appalling cooked meals, because my father was playing the long game. Eventually, it was Christmas lunch sorted. However, there were other implications of my parents stepping back to sit back and receive, as they both said jokingly was their right at that stage of their lives. My parents' friend Arnold joined us at Christmas after his wife died and decided to show his gratitude by washing the dishes. Arnold's version of washing dishes was more inclined toward disease management and propagation. Clearly, he'd never really paid much attention to his wife at the task. For him, it was a simple process of filling the sink with hot water, then depositing the plates, dishes and sundry used items in the sink without rinsing. Effectively, he washed the dishes and cutlery in a soup, then kept the good crockery in the kitchen cupboard until the following year. 12 months later, I realized what he'd done. I pulled down the crockery and inspected it. I acknowledged that it was his heartfelt contribution to the Christmas dinner. Think of each plate and dish as a pale cream ocean upon which small solid blocks of last year's cooked vegetables were interspersed. That's what happened when my uncle washed the best crockery and cutlery in warm soapy vegetable soup. I solved that problem the following year by not only cooking a 3-course meal for 4 of us, but washing all the dishes, cutlery and pans in between servings. I then got even further ahead of the game by spiking Arnold's lemonade with more whiskey. In exchange for hygiene, we had to put up with him singing the old rugged cross, "Ma'am" at the piano as usual, and then him weeping in his whiskey when the Queen popped by to say a few words. For a long time, I'd regarded cooking for my parents as an absolute pain. But that was only until I saw them become more and more fragile, and that's when I turned it into a privilege. One of the greatest gifts you can offer people is to cook a meal for them, which is why it was so challenging to cook for only one person after they'd both gone. The silence and the single plate were so damaging, and I invariably dove for the subcultural security of all single males with no dependents, namely, a fish finger butty. Being a carer for such a long time guarantees social isolation, and the solitary plate of rubbish food. I no longer had anyone to cook for, and had never really regarded my own needs as paramount. However, like many unfortunate events and absences in your life, you eventually get used to it. Food became little more than reluctant fuel stops through the day, and were it not for Jenny, there would be little food joy in my life. I am glad to say that things had definitely improved from the days when I'd be dependent for my energy input on a bottle of wine a night. I'd been thinking, which is in itself never a good thing. I'd been amending my belief in ghosts as a single species, and realized that it was far more complicated than that. I believed in the downright bloody weird I'd seen and engaged with, otherwise I'd be dismissing it all as delusional, which would have been delusional in itself. Throughout it all, I'd been awake and conscious, and none of those experiences were ordinary in any way. Yet, other than acknowledge that an event had happened, I'd engaged in very little in-depth thinking about it. Everything mental went onto a back burner somewhere, while I focused on long-dreamed of practical matters. I'd very recently been busy trying to move and reconstruct a pretty large greenhouse in the now treeless but once wooded area. The dive-bombing crows had buggered off, for the time at least, and it gave me the opportunity to realize an impossible dream of the past 20 years. Strangely, it wasn't that windy in the desolate woodland space, which initially begged the question, why they'd grown sheltering trees there in the first place. I discovered why while I was out collecting kindling and moving the last of the logs closer to the house. There was a concrete footprint where an original farmhouse had once stood. It was surprising to find a concrete floor, because they were generally compacted and limed earth that you'd cover with linoleum and rugs. I remembered that my great-auntie lived in her parents' house, and had 2 Welsh dressers up on bricks to stop the damp destroying them. I was fascinated by the bumpy, uneven floor and found it difficult to believe my father's explanation that my auntie more or less lived in a barn, be it ever so tidy and warm. That surprising discovery and flooring facts aside, it was an ideal spot. I had a foundation I could drill into, when I could borrow a masonry drill, that is. In concert with this discovery, Jack, a known rogue I got on with really well, had bought a bungalow a dozen miles away, and didn't want to leave a damn thing in his current rental if he could help it, or if he could steal it. How he could afford a bungalow was a debated money mystery, and I was unsure whether I was going to be receiving a stolen greenhouse. However, I regarded it as irrelevant because my little patch of earth was so far off the grid that no one would ever see it. When I turned up at Jack's garden, I was surprised to discover that either he or his girlfriend was a remarkable gardener. It was pointless asking Jack who had created the masterpiece of an English cottage garden, because he would have just lied. What did I care? I was getting my hands on a large greenhouse. I walked the length and breadth in my size 8s, and decided it was 11 feet by 13, and that is one substantial greenhouse. Later, I discovered a new one was worth more than £4,000. The large greenhouse was made of aluminium, and Jack reckoned it must have been at least 50 years old. Both of us were older than the greenhouse, and in those days, I felt as if I was older than even geology. Some of the glass was broken and cracked, and the odd piece was missing or replaced with polycarbonate sheet. Despite that, it was still a coherent and attractive representation of what a decent greenhouse should be. Over a few days, and some near fatal accidents, I removed all the glass. I then built a scaffold to hold the roof frame together for transportation using 4 long pieces of 4x2, bamboo cross braces, and a lot of duct tape and string. I'd been puzzling how to get the roof down off the sides when one day we had 5 people on site at Jack's, and I begged a favor of everyone. Jack might have been generous with someone else's property, but he was a committed complainer when it came to his time. Still, while they all held the weight on their shoulders, it only took me about 10 minutes to remove about 30 small aluminium nuts and bolts, to separate the roof from the sides. Quite a few of the bolts sheared, because they'd suffered through too many island winters, but finally we gently lifted, moved and placed the supported roof frame safely on the ground, and a few of us braced the structure further. It took me 3 car trips to carry the sides, the gable end pieces and all the glass and polycarbonate to my place. And a handful of hours to work out how I was going to rebuild the greenhouse sides ready to receive the roof. Now, bringing the roof over was going to be a major contract in itself. That was the part I'd been dreading, because we had to carry it, in one piece, about 2 miles down country roads that were narrower in places than the roof frame was wide. I had no worries about anyone coming towards us being a nuisance, because Jack was scary to the uninitiated. A couple of harsh F-offs from Jack would encourage anyone to reverse out of our way. Jack was a good friend to have, and an appalling enemy to face. He was just my type of mate. Discreet, and in your face at the same time. We used Jack's pickup truck for transporting the roof that was laden half on and half off the back. Jack and I were to walk behind holding and supporting the large roof frame in place. His mate Graham drove, and had to be sensitive to our challenges at the back, because the frame flexed every bloody way imaginable. Despite that technical challenge, we only experienced one major problem on our brief journey. And Graham resolved that one with such ease. I forgot to mention that Graham looked like a kickback combination of a visitor from Neanderthal times and an early Lynyrd Skynyrd type of hippie. One of those hippies who looked as if he was in constant communion with the mushroom people. Graham was 6'3", whip-like thin and scary as Beelzebub himself on a bad trip. He was also heavily into wibbly-wobbly shit, and would happily dance naked on thankfully isolated beaches, off his head on something or other, in a salute to the moon. I never inquired about the salute bit. Graham instinctively got the gist of what we were doing, gave us the thumbs up, got into the cab, and after a few minutes of inactivity we realized he'd fallen asleep. I took up a temporary position at the center of the overhanging end of the frame while Jack went to the front. He berated his friend with language more appropriate for deep space where no one can hear you. Before we set off again, Jack went back to the cottage and returned with a large empty plastic oil drum thing, and threw it in the back. We encountered one of those massive tractors about halfway to my place, containing a Dick farmer's Dick 17-year-old son on his mobile. Always the same MO with that lot. Anyway, most of them have had a chapel upbringing of sorts, and would always do their best to solve the problem they were causing. This one, however, he seemed to have come directly from Dick Central and just stopped there in the middle of the road, phone glued to his ear, and popping his horn for us to get out of his way. There was nowhere for us to go, and it was obviously impossible to reverse our fragile load. Dick made it clear he was going nowhere except forward, and revved his tractor to emphasize the point. So Dick had to be persuaded to the error of his ways. We could all see a gateway 100 yards behind the tractor, into which he would have to be persuaded. Graham egressed the cabin, looked at the idiot and then back at Jack, who gave him one of those dark shark-eyed nods in the Dick's direction. Thankfully, before going to negotiate a workable solution with the Dick, Graham extended us the courtesy of fetching the barrel, which he propped under the center of the back frame to give us a breather. "Have a word with the young gentleman," Jack grunted. Graham tapped his temple in a jaunty salute, and popped over to have a word with the young man, who was liberally sharing his invective in mute mode inside his space capsule. Before he thought to lock his door, Graham was up there, door opened, tombstone teeth counterpointing a death's head sardonic grimace. From the back of the pickup, it looked like Graham was employing his esoteric knowledge of body energy points, by grabbing the idiot's nuts in a vice-like grip and suggesting a few solutions by pointing back along the road to the open gate. From where Jack and I were standing, we could see that the young man had turned deathly pale, and I guessed he might have been sweating copiously. After issuing an unearthly scream that made us both wince and look away, it seemed that an agreement had been reached. The young man was still taking in painful deep breaths as we pootled past him. Other than that minor incident, we made it back to my place and crossed through the tree stealer's field to get to the former tree-laden copse. I'd expected there to be trouble, but Jack advised me that Graham had been in school with the man, who was sensibly terrified of him. I offered Graham a tenner for his help before he and Jack left. Graham raised his hand to decline, saying that it had been fun and popped a pill in his mouth. Jack rolled his eyes and said he'd drive. We wished each other well, and I was soon left alone with a large greenhouse roof that I had to somehow lift 6 feet off the ground on my own. Until that was done, I could only then begin growing my much fantasized tomatoes. I'd seen hide nor hair of Shadow for a few days. He'd waited a while to recover from our bramble gauntlet injuries before disappearing, although he still didn't look all that well when he left. But despite his injuries, I didn't doubt that he would be managing, if not taking part in a bit of havoc in the lives of abstract others in an abstract elsewhere. The challenges of raising the roof meant that I was preoccupied with my own ongoing imminent disaster. And I hadn't expected it to be so nerve-wracking raising the roof of a large greenhouse, and then attaching it to a frame which, embarrassingly, I'd had to dismantle and would have to reconstruct because I'd built it upside down. I wouldn't be the first, I assure you. In the meantime, the roof rose precariously, independent of the fact I'd yet to build the sides. The damnable thing bent all over the place like a drunk spider, as I raised it bit by bit on flower pots, on bricks, on scaffolding planks, one on top of the other, again and again, at 6 fragile points, 4 corners and halfway along each length. I lifted each corner or side of the roof frame to add another brick or pot, even the wheelie bin got in on the act. It was far more traumatic than anything Shadow had put me through to date. I kept losing my nerve on the lifting bit, and had to keep walking away to make myself a cup of tea and avoid looking at it. How on earth it managed not to fall over at the slightest fluff of wind, I don't know, because every time I lifted 1 point, say 6 inches at a time, the whole ridiculous edifice responded by shifting. That greenhouse roof seemed to defy every known physical law currently known, and was more sensitive than even Shadow. I only brushed softly against it once, and the damn thing moved a foot to one side, if not further. So far, it had taken me a full day to raise the roof to the appropriate height, and I was becoming more and more nervous, because I knew the weather was about to change. I was too scared to look directly at the precariously balanced roof, in case too many photons sent it crashing to the ground. So the last thing I did for the day was lay out all the previously dismantled side and end pieces around the flying roof. I stood back and tried to breathe away the stress headache. The main decision was, where was I going to start? It was all too much for my nerves for one day. I just wished it all the best for the evening and night, and vowed not to look in its direction again until morning. I took the gathering tension in my chest indoors for a sit-down with a glass of wine for company. It's good to have a simple plan, one with very few key movements involved. Enter house. Walk to cupboard above the kitchen sink. Pull out tumbler glass. Pull out bottle of nice warm Chianti from the bread bin. Twist off top. Pour half a glassful. Leave bottle to breathe. Sit down on the sofa and glance at the empty corner of the sofa from where Shadow was missing. I rested there for about 20 minutes, barely sipping, and allowing the infinitely collapsing greenhouse-related stress to subside. It's not drinking a full bottle of wine that's the problem, but how quickly you do it. That evening I was intending to compete with evaporation, and happy to come in second. Then I remembered I had to attend to one vital matter before I could rest. So I placed the glass on the table, and stepped out for the evening tour of the recovering garden. Even to my COVID nose, the roses were fragrant. The night-scented stock was at least 6 weeks away from bathing the evening and night garden with its heavy perfumed childhood-evoking scent. I wanted sultry still weather, so that I could add to my sensory memories of a dream aspired to and achieved. It was a dream being achieved despite temporary wanton destruction visited on it from an alternate universe, or universes. It had all got so complicated recently. Despite aliens, monsters and decidedly weird physics, this really was becoming the garden of my dreams, and the cottage had come on nicely too. I was proud of myself, and this would be enough of a legacy, even if no one else saw it at its best. Everything I could see about me was the product of my own hands. Even my general incompetence had been overcome with gentle perseverance. A disturbing thought struck me. Had I shut the door after me? It was closed. Here, in the middle of my verdant little invisible nowhere, I never worried about closing the door. Like my mother, I generally left doors open for fresh air. Even when closed, Shadow ignored it as an obstacle. Up to that point, it had been a day of achievement, however precarious, and these moments among the growing flowers and vegetables were some of the most pleasant in my recent life. I felt suddenly emotional because the most important people in my life could never be here to share it with me. Definitely. I knew I had. I'd left the door open. It was a pleasant sojourn buggered up by a closed door I knew I'd left open. Bloody aliens again. Had to be. I picked up the mattock I'd been using to earth up the spuds, and propped it on my right shoulder, ready and willing to implant it in something new and unwanted in my life. I took a deep breath and leaned into a brave step toward my own home. You can do a lot of thinking in a short distance in the quantum spaces between your ears, and I suddenly realized just how much I'd changed over the past few months. Once upon a time, there would have been no way that I'd ever have contemplated burying the business end of a mattock in someone's head. Nevertheless, by now it seemed an acceptable thing to do. Whoever was bringing crap karma into my day should have been glad the lawnmower wasn't closer to hand. Over the years, I'd learned vicariously that a confident demeanor either begins or avoids a fight, and I wished to give that ambiguous impression right then. The former if required. So, armed with a determined intention, a dark mood and a mattock, I opened the closed door and entered my own little cottage. Don't be so bloody dramatic. Put that damn thing down, and just tell me where the little bastard is. The voice sneered derisively from the sofa. Talking of bastards, this one had my glass in his hand, and worse still, was drinking my wine. Hope you don't mind I helped myself? He was a curious, confident and dangerous-looking character sat in Shadow's corner of the sofa, his shiny shoes on my little table. In the correct light and too much alcohol, he might look a bit like Johnny Depp, except this one was thinner, chillously snide and completely lacking the former's urbanity. He was also folded over himself, as if he were distorted by discomfort in his physical form. The stench of turnip gravy farts he'd brought with him was near overwhelming for one thing. I stood there with the mattock held in my hand, thinking I should employ the implement. Do you all stink? Billy No Mates looked offended. Good. He held up one long thin hand and an admonitory finger. Not a nice way to welcome a guest in your house. He relaxed back on the sofa and stretched his neck to release a physical tension. Something vaguely familiar about him didn't endear me to him in the slightest. I stood over him. I don't want you in my home. Now get out before you end up with an implant. I reached down with my spare hand to push his feet off my little table, when he leaned forward so suddenly, and in such an unnatural animalistic way, almost bending himself in half, that I instinctively pulled away. Not quick enough though, as his long thin ice-cold hand flashed out and grabbed my wrist and pulling me down with unexpected strength. He brought his face right up close to mine. It seemed to change in a snap and he hissed as his jaw extended to appear feral and savage. It's rude to touch people without their permission. Immediately he'd spoken, he let go of my hand and I pulled myself back upright. There was no smile there. Instead, there was a stark morally devoid coldness to his presence, as he sat there in his dark suit white shirt and thin cowboy tie. The shoes were well shone and perfect, meaning he hadn't walked down the lane to get here. The eyes though, they were black fathomless dead pools. Like a cat I'd recently encountered, he seemed to be viewing from somewhere else in a bemused and unreachable manner. Although his casual nature told me that he was definitely all there, and all here. I slowed my breathing down, and stared at him objectively, while tapping the mattock against my calf in a very gentle rhythm. He leaned back, my glass still in his hand, and he smiled at me through entirely black eyes. We watched each other closely for a minute or so, until I decided I was bored. I was bored. Maybe a bit more scared than bored. I was alone and I wanted my little friend near me. This wasn't one of those occasions when he left me to my own devices because the challenge was within my capacity to cope. I knew this was unexpected, and I guessed if Shadow had known he wouldn't have allowed it to happen. Nonetheless, foul-smelling evil bastard or not, this was still my house, and he hadn't been invited in or offered a glass of my wine. Plus, he'd succeeded in terrifying me. So, even though Terror and I were well acquainted by then, this person had reached below any constitutional or incidental defenses. My introspection aside, he made no effort to move from his now languid semi-recumbent posture from where he'd been gesticulating with the aid of my glass of wine. He looked as if he was conducting his own theme. He smiled a thin cold smile that suggested knowledge of what you were thinking. It was simple power play crap that fails and works against the perpetrator once you recognized it. I stepped outside and left the mattock leaning against the wall within reach. Then, I stood a moment in the doorway to find a brave spot inside my head around which I could gather myself. We just looked at each other for a while, me doing my best to appear casual, knowing I had no escape, and he in danger of pissing off Shadow should he return any time soon. I felt there was far too much self-regard and self-indulgence in his demeanor to worry the cold savagery I'd seen from Shadow. There again, there was no Shadow present to QED that hypothesis. Nature is continually trying to kill us to generate a more robust version, and the fact that you are alive proves you are a success. However, any woman silly enough to be looking around my home might not agree with that evaluation. And as the old saying goes, what doesn't kill you, generally leaves one hell of a mess. I considered myself well and truly buggered up in so many ways by recent events. However, I'd learned enough about myself and social alien politics, not to be cowed for long. Sod this. I took a step into my living room. I guessed there was nowhere I could escape to, and I knew I was more likely to fight harder for my own turf. You stink, I said once again. He was most offended by the notion and nearly dropped my glass in shock. The question was the level of danger he presented. That he regarded himself highly was clear, and the smell told me he probably didn't have many friends. He was vain and undeniably indifferent to my feelings. And was in the process of stealing my wine. For God's sake. Get your bloody feet off my table. He smiled at the expression, and looked as if I'd just tripped across his favorite topic. He held up a finger to gain my attention in advance of expressing his wisdom on the matter. I had no patience to indulge him and gave him no chance. And impelled by the momentum of admonishing an alien ghost monster, whatever the bloody hell he was, I went across and took the glass from his painfully bony pale hand. I picked up the bottle and walked past him. Smells of cow in here, he said. I think I was supposed to respond. But instead, I chose to be distracted from entering into a debate with whatever inhuman thing it was sitting lounging on my sofa. I managed to make it to the sink and gripped it firmly, taking in a few quiet deep breaths as I stared at my white knuckle bones, as distractedly fascinated with them as I'd been as a kid contemplating my skeleton. Some people get to you. It wasn't only the bemused little smile at my faux belligerence which failed to reach his black watchful eyes that scared me. No, it was more straightforward than that. It was everything about him. The knife Megan used to impale UHT milk cartons lay invitingly on the draining board, and I looked at it. I wasn't entirely defenseless against one of the denizens of some nearby hell who'd popped into my house and was sitting on my sofa. And he was after my little visitor. I don't think there would have been much of a mystery what I was feeling right then. I was distracted from my panicked considerations by the sound of a sigh and a rustling from the sofa. I wondered whether it was only his head rotating round to look at me. Whatever he was doing, I could feel his black eyes boring into my back, and I knew I'd better sharpen that long spoon I used to stir scouse in my multi-use pressure cooker. I looked down to my left and the garlic in the veggie tray. I remembered what my traveler guest had told me about the devil, Satan, whoever, because that's who I thought this was. What had he said? A self-publicist. He's not here, I said as I prepared to turn around and see where his head was relative to the rest of him. Thankfully, he'd only turned around where he was sitting and hadn't engaged in horrible theatrics. I can see that. He meshed the fingers of both hands and stretched and cracked his finger joints. I hated that at school. His sounded a bit more crepitus-laden though. Satan with arthritis? That was encouraging. Don't do that. And do stop with the bloody theatrics. Your greenhouse looks rather fragile. He waved a hand vaguely in that direction. I could have minions put it up for you if you wish. He followed it with an amused and unnerving little chuckle. Minions, eh? I looked again at the knife. At least I knew where it was, if I needed it. After all, I'd stuck knives in things before, hadn't I? The item on the sofa had demonstrated that the human he was portraying was merely an act. I relaxed my grip of the tumbler of wine in my hand and returned his glass to him as I walked past. He seemed entertained by my gesture. I sat down at my end of the sofa, pulled my small table away from him, and then looked at the fire that was barely hanging on in there. I needed something to do, anything to keep my mind moving. The fire had been running on idle since mid-afternoon, so it was a legitimate thing to do. I rose and went to feed it some branch kindling and a couple of small split logs. "You're not supposed to add fresh wood to fires," he said. "Global warming or something, not my problem anyway." He laughed raucously, seemingly entertained by himself. While he did that, I was more worried that he might spit on my carpet. I'm sure that a member of the hellish host would leave a worse mess on your carpet than Eva Hughes' cow did. Worse threats out there than that. The fire began to crackle amiably. I went back to the sink, pulled out a mismatching glass from the cupboard and poured myself a stiff glassful of Chianti, if such a thing existed. I sat down again and checked the fire before turning to him. Maybe indifference and boredom would chase him away. "Sit down if you want, but you haven't earned that right to put your feet on the table." He bobbed his glass slightly in acknowledgement. We were both half turned to each other and I was looking directly into his deep black eyes, completely black, iris and all. I stared into them unromantically, searching for something. I don't know what. They scared the bejazzes out of me. Then I remembered something useful I'd read in an SAS novel. Specifically, if you're not dead, then you've always got a chance. So we continued to sit there for a little while longer, looking at each other. Me, scared but curious, out of my league entirely and with nothing further to lose by being nosy. There was a smile swimming just below the surface, and I got the impression it was one of those creepy charming smiles seeking to draw you in. I ignored it and inspected whatever it was that was in front of me. His humanness was almost genuine, but that nearliness made the sight of him disconcerting, as if he'd had to make a bit of an effort to accommodate the human form and condition. The suit was good, and the shoes sharp and shiny. Just like a well-turned-out undertaker. Top end all of it. Except the pallor of the skin and the frail sharp-jointedness of him, his face, eyes, lips and body posture were at best pinched and unforgettable. Add the thin aquiline nose, and he might have been considered quite handsome in some demonic evil way. But if you distilled all I saw before me down to its bare essence, it was assured, demonic, and evil. Solicitous to the unholy. For my part, I leaned back and put my feet on my table. I suddenly felt tired as a sticky heaviness settled over me. I hoped the smell wouldn't stick to my clothes and Shadow's end of the sofa. He wouldn't be pleased about that. I shook my head, turned and looked sharply at my visitor in case he was doing something to me. But instead, he was only looking at the glass of wine after each small sip. I had to get the dead haddock to turn. I had to do something to get this alleged demon out of here because he gave the impression that he was happy to wait. "Do you have a name? Maybe it would be something entertaining and ironic." "Adversary," he said. "Or Ahriman." He pursed his lips as if expecting a shocked response. "Harry Man." He turned to me, clearly irritated. Maybe Ahriman was a name that made people, beasts and things across many galaxies quiver and quake, but here in my little house, it meant nothing. I repeated the name silently in an attempt to turn it into something I could understand. "Are you Indian?" I asked. It did sound Indian. "Are you taking the piss or something?" he asked angrily. "Sounds Indian. If it's not Indian, then what does it mean?" He turned and leaned forward and I saw flames in his eyes that might not be those of the fire behind me. "You'd probably know me best as Satan." He received an O from me, which I don't think made up for my sudden lack of terror. I realized that while he may well be Satan of legend, I decided for sanity's sake that he was nothing more than an unwelcome visitor, like a monster chicken or a minotaur. Dangerous, but still a visitor. "I suppose you're just like everyone else I've come across recently," I said, implying a question. The head turned toward me slowly as if attached to the curious glassful by an elastic band. Then, finally, the eyes escaped and snapped to attend to me and my question. "I have no idea who you've met recently." He held up the glass of wine against the light. "This is appalling wine, you know. Better not tell that to the Italians. They get emotional over that type of stuff. And they're very Catholic about such things." He dismissed the Catholic observation with a fey wave of his spare hand. "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement," he said. And took another sip of the wine in his glass. "They need me as much as I have to admit I need them. Curious that. It's the only component of our original charter that still works." Awful wine or not, I observed that he continued to drink. Was that a weakness? I don't know. Anyway, I didn't believe in heaven, and therefore couldn't believe in hell. Hence, while I suspected this inhuman was indeed Satan, or the devil, an alleged self-publicist apparently, all he could do was kill me. And the satisfying aspect of being killed is that no one is conscious of being dead. You just stop, with no awareness of having stopped or having ever been. It set me thinking. The woodland was gone and had removed option A from me. I'd lost the dignified and quiet means of self-removal. Therefore, he'd picked the wrong guy to intimidate. In a daft sense, I continued to acknowledge that I was no one, and although Shadow would not die for me, I, being daft, would probably put myself between him and danger. I regarded him again and considered. Could those bastard holes in space have had anything to do with him? While I was thinking objectively in terms beyond my fears and needs, Harry the Satan was less an object of abject terror, and more a cause of intrigue right then. I knew he was watching me carefully, and maybe I was playing into his hands. But if he and Shadow were old adversaries, then all their battles would have been tit for tat surely? I couldn't quite work out why he was here. Not for a second did I believe that there would be a physical fight between them. A confrontation, foul language and threats possibly. But if Ahriman were a leader then, like a wolf-pack leader he would be at the back viewing and guiding when it came to a punch-up. He seemed somewhat discombobulated by what must have been my silence and lack of respectful terror. Any port in a storm, I said meaninglessly, and gesticulated with my glass of wine equally meaninglessly. For his part, alleged Satan leaned further back on the sofa and balanced the glass on his chest. I was intrigued. So, what's he done to upset you? What hasn't he done? Too many things to mention really, he said smoothly and presented me with a thin smile. Things that don't concern you. Well, while he's a guest in my home, and you're here after him, I think it does concern me. I took a sip now, questioning whether the wine was that bad. Until then, I'd thought it was a full round fruity little wine. Maybe that's how Satan began to control you. He made you doubt something about which you'd previously been convinced. Call it a duty of care if you will, I said. Whatever. I was calm and logical. And I was determined to protect my home and little friend with whatever means that might present themselves, irrespective of the consequences. Equally, I was cold, but no longer terrified. My recent development experiences kept me toward the logical end of the terror spectrum. I further contemplated the alleged Satan's presence in my humble little cottage. Ahriman. His calm and unhurried faux gentility was nothing more than a tool to beguile fools to come closer. He gave a little cough and I attended to him again. Alleged Satan gesticulated over his shoulder with his thumb indicating the bottle on the draining board. Help yourself, I said. I was choosing my battles. I didn't notice him getting up and pouring another glass for himself. You? I turned around to see him holding the bottle out for me. I'd barely touched my glass. Fine, thank you. Whatever was going on here was again above my pay grade, so I decided to focus on my curiosity. I took another sip and contemplated the wine. Bloody cheek. It was a nice Chianti. 7 quid's worth at that. I watched him sit down and place the bottle on the table. If you were here in your proper form, I asked, how would the sofa hold up? I felt it was a reasonable question any concerned householder might ask, if the guy on the sofa next to you all of a sudden announced he was Satan. He tapped the seat next to him with his articulate thin fingers. Not very well, I don't think. He gave me a quick ingratiating smile followed by a slow deep in-breath. That's the thing. When you're obliged to move about, you have to remember in which realm you are. So you don't know where he's gone then? I shook my head. Not a clue. Does this sort of thing often, does he? Yup. All the time. Turns up, eats the food, sleeps, pays no rent, and, for someone who doesn't say anything, he's very sarcastic. He tipped back his chin slightly in acknowledgement. I think you humans call it narcissism. No, I said slowly, and rotated where I was. I think it's self-belief based on experience. For so many people and things to be aware of him, and for most of those to be scared of him, he must be pretty good at what he does. I've never really worked out what he does that makes you all so wary of him. I got the impression Satan had rolled his eyes, but it was difficult to see with eyes entirely black on slithery black. However, humans are pretty good at picking up the bloody obvious now and then. I wanted him out of here, and any battle between him and the cat to happen in a galaxy far, far away, and the cat to whip his ass good and proper while they were there. I can read your mind, he said. Really? Satan, allegedly so, yawned as I looked toward the closed front door. Had I done that? It could be a representation of being incarcerated, a subconscious psyops thing. A door could always be opened. And anyway, what would happen if Shadow were to return this very instant? Harry Satan leaned forward, placed his empty glass on the table and stayed there, ungainly and unnerving with his elbows on knees. Clearly unfamiliar with the form he was in. He stared past me to the fire, which was coming on nicely. He might have been feeling at home. I could destroy you just like that. He shook his head as he spoke to me, and I got the impression that I was a bit of a puzzle for him. Instead of running through the door in terror, I'd allowed him to drink my wine and engaged him in a conversation. You won't, I said. There were plenty of logs by the fire. Even though they were fresh, they would be drying because of the heat. The fire reminded me of our council house. Saturday nights gathered together to watch Doctor Who and the Generation Game. Evelyn Dixon of Dock Green. The fire was comforting. Satan tittered. I really wouldn't push me if I were you. This is all so much bigger than you. You're just an inconvenience. And yet here you are, talking to me, instead of whatever it is you're threatening to do, I said. I might yet kill you. Then I'll be dead, I said flatly, and stared evenly back at him with no real animosity to his proposal. Only boredom. I could do worse. Really? Barbecue you in the fiery pits of hell. Something entertaining like that. Does that scare you, human? No, I said, and looked to the front door wondering if my hero was going to make an appearance or not. The odds were against that happening. And anyway, I decided this guy or thing was just another operator in Shadow's world. No. His full attention was on me. No, you won't, I replied. Most life forms seem to care about such things. But you don't. Nope. After you criticized my wine, then what's left? He didn't seem inclined to believe that and was growing angry. I was tired. I was bored. I wanted my little mate here and, more importantly, I didn't want this smelly bastard anywhere near my garden. Now, that was a cause to fight over. Do you think I'm bluffing? You'll do what you feel needs to be done, I said. Which is why I'm beginning to doubt who you are and what you are. I reckon you're only here looking for a hostage, and you reckon he'll make himself vulnerable to save my sorry ass. I laughed at the ridiculousness of his expectation. I'll only be one afterthought among many that will pass through his mind as he smacks your head off. I've seen him do that. But I wouldn't expect loyalty to get in the way of what happens between now and then. He looked perplexed, leaning his sharp elbows on his knees in a challenging non-human manner, and staring at the closed front door. He seemed to be weighing up my response. Then suddenly he leaned back, put his feet up on the table next to mine and turned those eyes onto me. Do you want to know why I hate humans? His voice was flinty and crisp. He had abandoned any artifice. There was rock cracking behind the hard consonants and any indulgence had slipped back into his box of tricks for humans. This was a serious intent to frighten. That was enlightening. I guess the worse the intimidation, the safer I was. You're seriously not afraid of me, are you? I used the top of my index finger to dab out a speck of something from my wine glass. Would it matter if I was? Not really. I consider fear as a sign of respect. I guess that. So I won't bother trying to stop anything you do because it'd be outside of my control. So far, all this had been an attempt at undermining and bullying. And I knew how to deal with that crap. In my experience, he said, humans would drop each other in excrement given the opportunity. But we're still here, I said. And you're the one in the minority. Evil doesn't seem to be able to succeed in the long run because eventually people get fed up of it. You reckon? It was a point he felt confident enough to emphasize with a contemptuous snort. How naive. History proves it, I said. Again and again and again. I winced inside, but kept a straight face as he transitioned from soft irritated urbane to harsh, sharp, feral, hissing and then back. I didn't react. Astonishingly, I didn't respond. It looked as if his jaw had dislocated and altered into a vicious muzzle full of layers of sharp teeth. This type of horror damages you at your core and would leave most people sniveling in fear. For me, it was a crap sci-fi horror movie, and I didn't like those. He looked at me, his eyebrows suggesting continuing surprise at my flat effect, then he looked away again in contemplation. He was reflective for a moment and his posture told me he was searching about somewhere internal. Finally, alleged Satan leaned back and tapped his left leg with his free hand. Sorry to sound rude, I said with no apology intended. For a simple human, you've got a knack for being casually offensive. I feel obliged to be, I replied. I didn't invite you into my home, and I'm generally very particular with whom I share my wine. He reached to the bottle on the table, and fair's fair, he shared the remaining wine equally between us both. He held up his glass of wine against the warm light from the fire. "This is like banging your head against the wall," he said, referring to the wine. "You get used to it after a while." I decided on a diplomatic nod. All the time wondering how all of this was going to end. Before long, he'd probably be looking for more booze. Yup, it was time to be direct. "What do you want to see him about?" He snorted again. "A little matter of destroying a casino, brothels, and plenty of other assets I use to attract the weaker members of a few species." Ah. Discrete events began to click together and construct a form with which one could negotiate a sense. Was that? I tried to gauge which direction it would be and jabbed a thumb vaguely over my shoulder. I had a light buzzing in my ears with that third glass. I earned a grunt. A sad loss, that. Useful place. "Can't you set it up again?" I asked. Not trying to be helpful, you understand? You're doing well for a human. Besides comedic entertainment, this little planet of yours occasionally has its uses in the broader scheme. And you'd be making money or something out of it? I couldn't imagine Satan being interested in cash somehow. No. He seemed irritated. Not money. That place attracted the worst of all species, and sometimes I find the odd gem worth corrupting. It gets so boring. So now and then I have to cause a bit of havoc for my own entertainment and sanity. And then Shadow goes and blows it up. He looked puzzled. Like others, he seemed taken aback by the name given to his number one enemy. "Bastard went and blew the bloody lot up, didn't he?" "I saw it," I said, and held up my spare hand. "I just happened to be there." He didn't care. He was off on a rant. It's the sort of thing he's renowned for. But he went too far this time and he'll pay for it. "Good luck with that," I said sarcastically. "Many killed?" "Who cares?" It was obviously a very personal and a very, very painful loss. He was back staring at the door again. It was a brilliant little setup in that no zone. "What's that?" "It's a short-lived anomalous dimension that springs up now and then, not short-lived in human terms of course, because your lot doesn't last long. They pop up all over the place and touch other dimensions. In this case, it touched yours." "That's nice," I said. He was decidedly grumpy over the matter and would probably hold on to a slight for millennia. Maybe never let it go. "So how long's he been gone?" "A couple of days. Sometimes he's back for a week and then off again." I saw a chink of hope. "Rather than wasting your valuable time here, I can tell him you called and probably wanted an apology. How about that?" He gave me a smirk. "Nice try. I'll wait." "Well, you can't stay here for long because I'm planning an early night now that there's no wine left. Haven't you got worlds to conquer or something?" The last thing I wanted was to go to bed. I wanted him gone before he found the other bottle. I also wanted to open the door and all the windows to rid the house of his turnip-based stench. "I suppose it must be frustrating for you, with the lives of people passing so quickly from your perspective." "You miss the point," he riposted. Oh dear, I thought. I'd hit on a favorite topic to highlight the difference between ephemeral humans and him. Individuals, whatever species, are only important when they're important. The difficult part is setting things in motion toward moral collapse. Is that always your objective? My question looked as if it gave him a rush of enthusiasm on the subject. Of course it is. That's when I go to the trouble of finding someone, whatever convenient race or species, usual caveats, with plenty of ambition but no brains. The last bit's easy. The early stuff, the preparation, that's the difficult part. It needs a refined touch. The lighter the better, it's more satisfying, because any civilization is always on the brink of collapse and utter chaos is no fun at all. I imagine. I had to concede that he had a point. I nodded to show my agreement. "So the place that Shadow blew up, I don't understand why you can't magic it up again?" He waved his hand above his head and seemed to be in a state of passing despair. "Illusions always fade if you're not there to keep an eye on them. People need to feel concrete and flesh. There's an entire industry out there building these places for me, and they've got too many projects to abandon, they tell me. So they've put it on the list." He turned to draw me into understanding his pain. "We all know what that means, don't we? They'll get back to me with a quote apparently." "So you want to punch Shadow? I can understand that." "Punch?" He angled his head sarcastically. "Maybe a bit more than that. It would be interesting to see how that ambition panned out." "And you came here in person? You couldn't send a horde of zombies or something?" "Sorry, I don't know the collective noun for zombies." He turned those horrible black eyes on me again. "I could send zombies if you'd find that entertaining. Impossible to control when the buggers get going. Other than proving more irritating than a few humans I've met." He pointed a long finger at me. I wouldn't do that to you. Like I said, despite what nihilists believe, no one gains much out of outright chaos. It'd just be a horrible mess for someone to clear up afterward. He paused a moment to reflect on how complicated Shadow had made his life. He continued. Anyway, after the chaos you've lost the dynamic you worked so hard to set up. He arched his right eyebrow and leaned over to me conspiratorially again. Between you and me, the best use of zombies is compost. This was suddenly weird. Something odd was beginning to happen. Is Shadow likely to let you do what you want? I must tell you about something irritating that happened when Shadow first turned up. I knew nothing about him, other than he was a little black cat, and I was content to look after and feed him. Don't get me wrong, I've spoiled every cat I've ever had as a little mate, but when I found myself mashing up his food, giving him the last piece of ham, and last drop of milk, I realized I was being managed a bit more than usual. I confronted him about it and he answered by making me smash a raw egg against my forehead. I'm a human, I had shouted, and not your bloody entertainment. To which he responded by making me stick a banana in my ear. I shook my head, smiling in remembrance of his disregard and finding the matter amusing. What's the matter with you? Satan must have been puzzled by my smile. It's well that he should be. He was holding a banana in his hand and somehow hadn't noticed. Shadow was speaking to me with the aid of the fruit. All would be well, said the banana. Nothing, I said, and had to look away. Nothing at all. I looked back at what I'd just seen. Hi Shadow, I said to the small dark lump by the door. All well? I'd realized over the past few months that this cat could smirk. He might not have had Roger Moore's articulate eyebrows, but he could still be expressive in his face once you realized that he could be. He didn't seem to be scared at all. Instead, Shadow stared at Satan, Armin, Harry, or whoever, who responded with venomous hatred. I paid no heed to Shadow and focused on Satan, who was shaking with rage. Then he noticed the banana in his hand and, not knowing the joke, threw it at the fire. Such was his anger that his disguise began to fall away and I began to grow concerned for my sofa. The urbane, well-turned-out character he'd been affecting grew sharp in all aspects. His chin grew more pronounced and disproportionate, as did his cheekbones. His nose flattened and his forehead receded to a bullet head. It was all rather disconcerting. I was too fascinated to be scared right then as Nosferatu appeared on my sofa. His hands were talons and the knees were suddenly pointing the wrong way. Perhaps the images we'd been shown of Satan were accurate after all. This should be interesting, I thought. I only hoped the cottage would still be standing at the end of it all. No words were spoken. None I could hear anyway. Yet I knew these two were having a chat. And not a friendly one either. Satan sat in Shadow's seat, which was cause enough for trouble. Satan slowly reached out a talon and pointed at me and I knew my life was being threatened. The bastard then leaned forward. Shadow was small compared to the frightening sharp-boned creature that sat a few feet away from me. I really should have been more worried, I suppose. Instead, I sat there just fascinated. Who would have thought horror and science fiction were being acted out here in my kitchen cum diner cum living room? I hoped that Shadow was fighting for my ass, and not only his place on the sofa. You could never be sure of his motivation. The duty of care seemed to flow only one way in this abusive relationship. I was being pointed at again. I looked at Nosferatu next to me and then Shadow. The little bastard actually winked at me. Saw this, I said, and got up. Even in his terrifying guise, I could see that the evil bastard was taken aback. Not the cat. How dare you show such appalling disrespect? The words were acidic hisses. I caught the gist of a few of the threats coming my way and saw the fires of hell burning in his black eyes. I didn't care. My little mate was back and I was as safe as I was ever going to be. He stared at me with such a violent expression and seemed puzzled that it didn't affect me at all. Once you lose your power over someone, you can never really reclaim it. I was up on my feet and nodded toward Shadow. This is between you and him. Nothing to do with me. I'm going to make myself a cuppa. But do you know, if this was a game of football, I think your manager would be telling the substitute to warm up. I wasn't being irreverent at all, disrespectful maybe, certainly. But I'd lost the edge of interest. These galactic titans could get on with it without my help, I was sure of that. It didn't matter if I were here or not. I switched on the kettle and looked back into my living room. Satan seemed to have regained a degree of decorum and was once again the urbane black-suited chap. The air between him and Shadow crackled and shimmered like two contrary flowing sea currents meeting. My small abusive friend seemed undisturbed and casual. There. On Satan's neck. I saw it. A small trickle of sweat before he was thrown back in his seat. His head moved just like Shadow's before he terminated something. He was assessing the small cat before being thrust back in his seat again. I got the impression he was suddenly more intrigued than fearful. Shadow had thrust him back into his seat for the third time when Harry suddenly waved his arms dramatically. "This is getting us nowhere." He rose suddenly, leaving a dent in the sofa cushion to reinflate itself. And then I saw him stagger. I looked down at Shadow, and suddenly realized I had to get the monster out of my house. Urgently. The door burst inwards and frightened the life out of me. Satan pointed down at Shadow as he stepped toward the door. "This isn't over. We will have a proper reckoning." The cat continued to stare at old Harry calmly, and I began to panic. So I shouted to distract him. "You damage anything in the garden and you'll be leaving with a pitchfork up your ass," I shouted after him. "Is that clear?" I didn't have a pitchfork, but was happy to employ the mattock for the same purpose. He turned and gave me a look of such hatred and promise. He snorted and took his arrogance out with him with too theatrical a haste, but left his odor. I was so fascinated by Satan being inconvenienced in this undignified way by a small cat, and didn't realize Shadow's eyes were on me. He wasn't moving, just looking from me to the front door. I realized what he wanted and went across and stood at the door to ensure Satan had left the building. I knew there would be no footprints no matter how hard I searched. There was no sign of him. He'd disappeared. It was growing dark and weather appropriate to the fire in the hearth. Maybe rain before morning. It had that kind of musky smell to it. Not as bad as Satan though. I quickly forgot about him and rushed back toward Shadow to stare at the vulnerability I was worried Satan had spotted, that could have been the end of us both. What the hell happened? I dropped to my knees beside him. He had a 6-inch gash along his right back leg, and it was so deep that I could see the muscle within scarred by a burn. I winced. I was taking no crap off the cat, and because I hadn't stuffed a banana in my ear yet, I presumed I had his permission to take care of him. So I fetched the softest towel I had ready for sensitive visitors who've never visited me, wrapped it around him and lifted him gently before heading for the car and the emergency vet. 2 hours later, we were back in an aired house. I'd left the front door and all the windows open. No thieving humans tended to come this way, only satanic forces apparently. And I'd hidden the wine somewhere where even that bastard wouldn't find it if he ever dared come back. Shadow was asleep, the fur had been shaved around the wound and 30 little stitches tidily knitted the gaping wound together. The emergency vet had smelled the wine and those accusatory eyes were far more damning than anything I'd experienced that evening. My abusive little mate was hurt, and I couldn't explain to the vet why a cat living in the middle of nowhere looked as if he'd been shot with a laser gun. Again, I was learning to leave small worries like the police to drift away. I'd seen this before. If the vet were inclined to send the police or RSPCA around, she'd probably end up pruning her roses in the dark. I looked again at Shadow in deepest concern and with a new sense of awe and fear. He was sleeping his way into the cat's cure while I sat watching him over a mug of tea. I think it was appropriate later on that I had my little breakdown. I leaned back on the sofa looking at him, and reflected on what he'd done that evening even though grievously wounded. Still, I told him, you need better enemies. My little hero stirred uncomfortably.